Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Greedy corporate mega stores, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a law in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, tell your lawmakers, hands off my rewards. Tell them to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week, we are so delighted to have both the New York Times now best-selling author and the Sunday Times, as in the London Times, also best-selling author, Sarah Pearse on. We recorded this interview some time ago. We recorded it at the beginning of February, but we wanted to hold it so that all of you got a chance to actually pick up her brand new book. It's a debut novel. It's called The Sanatorium, and it's very much a sort of Christie-esque locked hotel mystery.
Locked building mystery.
I know. And we were delighted to talk to her.
We really were. And if any of you have not yet picked it up, if there are any of you left, we encourage you to do so, especially if you would like to, before our conversation, which is going to start right now.
So we are here with Sarah Pearse, and we had such a great time reading her brand new book, The Sanatorium, and it's available to our UK listeners and to our US listeners. So this is not something where, sometimes we do interviews where people have to wait months in advance. This is not one of those cases. Everybody should just go out and buy it because, what do we love more, Kemper, than, mysterious murder sprees in snowy, isolated settings. It's a real sweet spot for us.
100%.
So we were delighted to read it. I think that our listeners will also devour this. And we're so excited that you're here to talk about it, Sarah.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And we're obviously going to shoe in Agatha Christie into this because, it's sort of our raison d'etre. But
that's what we do.
That's what you do.
Just to start it off, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came to write a mystery generally? Because, I don't know that that's necessarily the first thing people always go to. So, we always like to find out about why people approach mystery as their act of writing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I actually started off writing short stories. And when it came to sort of writing the novel, I obviously had the idea for the plot came to me after reading an article, but the actual sort of whole mystery idea is really something that I love to read. So I think as a writer, you do tend to want to create the sort of moments as a reader that you've enjoyed the most. And I would probably say my go-to books are mysteries and thrillers. So I love the whole sense of kind of finality. You get the really good mystery, the beginning, a middle and an end, and also sort of following along with the detective. And so as an author, that was a huge sort of challenge and an inspiration to me. I really loved the idea of trying to set about writing my own. So when I kind of got the setting for the book, and that came to me sort of straight away, it lent itself, I thought, to the mystery. So it was quite an easy choice in a way.
I'm curious, who would you say the most formative authors were for you as a reader and also as a writer? And I think sometimes it's a different answer for those two.
Yeah.
All writers are big readers, obviously. So it sounds like you were, you've been a longtime mystery fan. Who did you read growing up, and who would you say influenced you the most when you were writing this mystery specifically?
Yeah, it's probably a sort of huge range, actually, both everything from sort of mystery writers to everything outside of the genre. So growing up, I loved everything, probably like a lot of children. I loved everything Enid Blyton. So I loved, and I think obviously there's mystery there, but I think there's that sense of adventure. And I think people have asked the question before about, are those sort of early years really formative in reading? And I think they are as a writer. I think everything, Enid Blyton for me, and anything in the mystery genre really, funny enough, I read a lot of sort of Nancy Drews and that kind of thing. And I think everything where you have that real sense of adventure, and as I say, you're going on a journey as a reader, is something that I loved. I love that sense of something bubbling beneath the surface of kind of everyday life. And I remember being hugely disappointed though as a child that there wasn't mysteries like in The Secret Seven and The Famous Five, where there are mysteries at kind of every street corner and you can't go out and catch the baddie. So yeah, I'd say those sort of formative years. But one of the writers now who I find hugely inspiring, I love Joe Nesbo. So I love his Harry Hula series. I don't know if it's something you've read a lot of, either of you, but yeah, I love his books. I really like the kind of very realistic characters.
I have to say, Sarah, they terrify me though.
They
terrify me.
Yeah, that's a sense, actually, a little bit sort of inspirational for me in that sense. A few people have said, oh, there's sort of scenes in the book which can be, very, very scary. And I think perhaps I err on the side of suggestion rather than kind of outright gore or murder. But yeah, I do love in his books that sense of sort of looking over the shoulder that you get. But I also like the kind of very flawed central character you have in Harry Hula, who I just love. But also Agatha Christie. I grow up, it's a huge thing where I live, simply because her childhood home is kind of just a few minutes away. It's been demolished now, but her holiday home is still there and a huge attraction. So yeah, we grew up kind of steeped watching a lot of Agatha Christie and hearing a lot about her. So yeah, huge inspiration. Another author I'd say I also really love for her kind of descriptions of the natural world is an author called Michelle Paver. And she's written a few great ghost stories, which I love. And also Sarah Waters, who kind of, has written one book which has been really influential called The Little Stranger.
Oh, it's terrific.
Where the house becomes a huge character. So when I was kind of writing, that was very inspirational for creating my Hotel Le Sommet.
I love The Little Stranger. I love all of Sarah Waters's books.
I do. Yeah,
she's so fantastic.
Yeah, amazing. Just every sentence is so honed. I'm just, hugely admire her.
She has a real quality of the Victorian in her, despite being a contemporary author. So I think it's like an amazing feat that she sometimes pulls off in those books.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have that sense of timeless. I think someone could read the book in 100 years from now and it doesn't date at all. It's wonderful.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because she set one of them even in Victorian times. And I remember thinking, wow, this is really convincing in a way that it almost never is. It's actually so hard to do that. It's a good point.
Yeah, I think some of my most memorable books are ones where even if they're set in the present day, they've got kind of a sense of nostalgia of something you remember from your own childhood, or even just think about in the present day. Tessa Hadley is someone who I just absolutely love, and she's written a book called The Past, and it kind of makes me feel nostalgic for a time I didn't even live in, which is amazing.
No, one of my best friends, one of my childhood best friends and I went through a real Tessa Hadley phase. I think last year, which is probably odd for Americans. But, we read a bunch of them before the pandemic. I think I read like 4 of them.
You did a binge.
It's so funny. We've never even talked about, I don't understand how this never came up on this podcast, Catherine. I am obsessed with Tessa Hadley.
Oh my gosh, I have found my spiritual home.
Sarah, you're bringing us together in a way. We spend so much time together, Kemper and I, and somehow you're bringing us together in a way that we could not have anticipated.
Have you read The Past? Because it's the book I have read and reread. There's kind of dreamlike moments. Her description of kind of nature and just, it's amazing.
The Past is gorgeous. It's really funny. I think some American listeners might appreciate actually the way that I think of Tessa Hadley, which is that she's one of the only writers who, when a short story of hers is published in the New Yorker, I actually like it and enjoy it. The New Yorker short story, the New Yorker fiction, I went through a period of several years where I was like, I'm going to read this short story in every single issue. I'm just going to do it because I'm going to learn a lot. And what I learned is that I hated 95% of them. And I barely ever read the fiction in now. But Tessa Hadley, without fail, and it would often be an excerpt from her book. And that's actually how I discovered her. And then I said, well, I have to read everything this woman has written. And she's just, I mean, she's in my top 3 probably of contemporary authors. Actually, I adore her.
And she is so readable. It's funny, you said I kind of got an anthology of some of the short stories, and there's one that's probably similar to my mum's kind of generation in terms of the time she's speaking about with Jakari, a game, this girl kind of hitting the ball on the rope with the paddle. And she just, it's a time I didn't even live in, but I can't, it's just this quality to the writing that, every sentence is just perfect. I kind of savor every sentence, which I think is really rare. And it's similar with Sarah Waters as well, actually. Yeah.
She establishes a sense of interiority that I think no one else does. Where I'm like, I'm living inside this person's life, inside this person's head, and that of course makes you. It's like one of the my most cherished kind of effects of reading, which is that you feel connected to the character, to the author. You just feel more connected, even though you're sitting on your couch reading a book. And she does that better than anyone I can think of in the moment. That's. For me,
because that is fascinating, because in the past she goes, obviously the points of view change, and you, like you say, you really do feel different ages of people that you're inside the heads of, and you really I just thought it's amazing how you can seamlessly flow, because sometimes I think kind of one character can bleed into another and you're not always sure who you're reading and which point of view, but she does that so effortlessly. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, no, that's well. And what I love is that so many of your answers to readers, other writers that are important to you, aren't necessarily mystery writers, which I think is so often the case as well. I mean, obviously, mystery readers and mystery writers are influenced by, a wide range of authors. And,
absolutely,
as a writer, there's going to be a lot of formative influences that can fall outside of that. And I think Tessa Hadley, in a weird way, makes a lot of sense as a big influence for a mystery writer, because a lot of what she's doing is what makes a mystery sort of stand out. If you can establish, for example, that sense of interiority, or explain a point of view, and make it so that you can understand why someone committed a murder, or
absolutely.
Yeah.
And also the natural world. Sorry, no, go on, Catherine.
Oh no, I was just going to say, we always talk about in our episodes about how one of Christie's favorite authors was Dickens, and that's not about interiority, but it's certainly about procedure.
Yeah. And storytelling, just sort of page, ability to turn pages, right? Dickens wrote a lot of pages, but you want to turn them.
A lot of them.
A lot of them.
A lot of pages. I think that kind of page turning thing is really interesting when you say that about story. And I think that's something that Christie does really well. I think that sense of, I know some people have sort of spoken about character and how always you don't necessarily get a deep dive into the characters, but I think what she's achieving in terms of plot and the page turning is phenomenal. I think sometimes now, some books I'm reading, I think perhaps we have lost a little bit of sense of that storytelling. And I think, you need that sort of propulsion through the book. When you're writing a mystery, it's really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, propulsion's a really good. I mean, it helped that, for example, Dickens was getting pretty much paid by the meter.
There's an incentive.
It was an incentive, but I do think sometimes there's a kind of school of current books, which I will not name names, that I'm not a huge fan of, which are just very, very circular. And you do lose a lot of that, and I think that's sort of been the mode really in contemporary fiction for a while now. And
there's a bit of snobbery with stories sometimes, I think, which is interesting.
Yes, I completely agree. But you obviously have very good taste, Sarah.
That's so amazing, both of you, because honestly it's quite a rare thing when I've been chatting with people with Tessa Hadley. I have met a few hardcore fans, but not lots, so that's really great.
No, and I think I think we've never really quite made that point either, that there is this contemporary snobbery when it comes to story, which I think does account for some of the belittling that can happen when Christie's name comes up. It's also, why I think we had that recent spate of autofiction, for example. The idea being, story is...
By the way, that was exactly what I was referring to, but
Is it?
Yes.
Yeah. No, that's it. Yeah. It's the autofiction craze, I think, came from, and, a lot of authors that I respect, even Zadie Smith, I remember at some point wrote an essay, I don't know where, in the Times or something, where she said, at this point, I find story embarrassing. By the way, this was before Swing Time came out. I mean, she's still engaging in story, obviously.
Yeah.
She was saying, there's almost a sense of embarrassment at the notion of just creating some fake narrative for the purposes of trying to get at something deeper. And for a while, I think people were almost abandoning story and giving up on it and saying, well, I guess I'm just going to record what happened to me in minute detail in my life, because that's the only way to do anything different now, because story's over. And it's like, no, I don't think so, because we need to be entertained and, swept up.
Particularly at the moment, I think that's actually a really good point. I was chatting with someone else on another podcast about that kind of escapism. And they were saying there was a lot of kind of locked room thrillers and those kind of things coming through. But I do think that sense of escapism, I think also there's a danger you leave behind a lot of readers who, do just want a great story. And so they'll watch great films on Netflix and series. And that obviously there's a huge importance on story there. But I think, I've had a few people sort of saying about my book and about other books that have that kind of story element. Oh, I've not read a good old fashioned story in a way for a while. And I think, it's a shame if we do forget that, a lot of people do like reading a good story.
I mean, out of curiosity, you mentioned Jo Nesbo, and one of the things that I would point to is that I think that Scandi Crime kind of repopularized a kind of more traditional mystery novel in a lot of ways. Not that they've ever gone out of fashion, they never have, but the Scandinavian sort of noir vibe, which I certainly love. I mean, I love Wallander too.
No, I think that's a really good point, because I think the Scandi, I think in a way it kind of made it cool again.
Yeah,
it's that kind of
exactly. Yeah. I think Henning Mankell and Jo Nesbo and company made it cool again.
Yeah, no, I really do. And I read, I remember reading The Ice Princess, one of Camilla Lackberg's. That kind of, it was just interesting what she did. She had a very kind of friendly character in Erica. But I mean, there was obviously the murderous scenes. And I think you have that kind of, it was a generation of sort of younger authors. And it made it contemporary. I think there's a fresh take on things. And as you say, I think with Nesbo, some kind of, almost some gory moments there, which is sort of evolved away from the sort of golden age where I think you didn't have those moments. But I agree. I think it did make it something that just was more contemporary and people could relate to.
Did that have any influence on your choice of setting? Because we should tell our listeners who have not yet read Sarah's book that it's set in the Swiss Alps, in the snow.
Yes.
So, certainly we're getting, I'm from the frozen north myself. So it very, very much familiar to me. And, there's an element of that here too, in yours.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think for me, I love reading books. I love watching films that are set in the snow. But I think the sort of inspiration, I lived in Switzerland in my kind of 20s, and I did a degree course in English and creative writing, and kind of I wasn't actually actively writing at the time. I had a job and I was working. But when I sort of lived out there and we used to travel at weekends to the mountains, I just always kept coming, I'd love to set a story here. It's just the atmosphere. I mean, you have moments on the mountain, as you probably know, where it's a huge snowstorm and the weather's coming in and it's really scary. I think there's something, you're in this huge kind of open landscape, but it's also kind of quite claustrophobic when the mountains are sort of around you and quite dark. And I just always thought it'd be a great place for fiction. So I think my sort of direct inspiration really came from living out there. And we now as a family kind of go quite a few times a year. So it's probably a direct inspiration, but definitely love reading about sort of books in the snow as well.
Yeah, I think that I always, my mom and I always like to, we don't talk about it very frequently, but I was coming back from a doctor's appointment when I was probably in middle school, and we had to go quite far to get to a specialist for asthma, which is also funny given that asthma is a theme in your book.
Yeah.
And so we were coming back from an asthma specialist and a blizzard hit while we were on the highway.
Oh my
God. And we I've never seen my mother that scared in my entire life. It was already going to be a 2-hour drive. Probably it took us 5.5 hours, and we were watching semi trucks. I don't know what the word is in Britain for like a long haul giant lorry.
Yeah, kind of. I think maybe like an articulated lorry, something like that. Like a big, yeah.
We were watching them be blown off the road in front of us.
Oh my gosh, that would terrify me.
Yeah, my mom was trying not to cry and just white knuckling the steering wheel to stay onto the road. And it was we actually just to this day barely ever talk about it unless it's like one of the worst experiences ever, because the claustrophobia and like the sheer terror of that is so bad.
That actually makes me feel quite panicky now thinking about that. That's awful.
Yeah. So like I'm sitting there like, I was like probably 12 or something with an inhaler and white knuckling while like we're trying to not be blown off the road.
I think that's also scary as a child if you see your parents scared, isn't it? I think you kind of look to them as, not scared by anything. So when you see them scared, it's kind of like, oh no.
And I think like there's a really lovely moment in your book where Ellen's flashbacking later to thinking about her mother sitting on a bed.
Yes, yeah. After I won't say too much, but I know where you are.
No, we don't want to spoil your book, but I think there's a really nice moment where she's trying to finally process her childhood trauma and remembering that moment. And I think that was really well articulated, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, it was kind of, I think as a child, if you perhaps, obviously lucky enough not to happen to me, but I do know of people that have experienced that. And I think, if you have that kind of grief, I think as an adult, I think there's probably a pressure, isn't there, to kind of sort of hold it all together, and it perhaps might come out in kind of smaller moments. And I think that's what I wanted to express.
I think I was actually just dovetailing on that with Ellen, the character, because I was very interested in her and what went into your thought process as to choosing her as your protagonist. And I guess just to set the scene, so to speak, for those who haven't read the book yet, the book, of course, takes place in the Swiss Alps. It's at this sort of grand hotel, which used to be a sanatorium, nearly 100 years earlier. So it has this potentially dark past, and there are weather events that are happening, so that we have our closed circle sort of isolated setting here that we know and love as mystery fans, and which is why Catherine and I were very much in our happy place. That makes us sound like we have a psychological condition, which perhaps we do, as we were reading the book. But Ellen, technically, your protagonist here, and we see a lot of the story, not the entire story, but a lot of the story through her eyes. She is a police officer, actually, which means that technically this is, a piece of crime fiction with a police investigator at its center. And yet she is such an unlikely, quote unquote, cop protagonist. And that felt very intentional, the way that you were, that you were drawing her as a character. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about that, how you came up with Ellen and the decision to make her a police officer with so much backstory and so much baggage about that she's bringing into this.
We should just mention also for listeners that the reason why she's at this posh hotel in the Alps is she's meeting her estranged brother. That's the setup to this.
Right.
Yeah, I think for me, I wanted her very much to kind of come across, I suppose, as a normal character who just happens to be a cop or a detective. I think lots of the sort of detective fiction I've read, and obviously I've loved it, absolutely, but a lot of it kind of, I think it sort of feels a little bit sometimes by numbers in the sense of how the character's formed. Mm-hmm. So they might have a flaw or a trope in terms of, alcoholism or addiction, but I kind of wanted her just to have a sort of quite a rich interior life. Interesting what we were saying kind of with regards to Tessa Hadley. And I think having that sort of rich backstory, that very much came to me while I started sort of forming her as a character and started thinking about who she was and her motivations. And I think that book backstory formed, and obviously you don't know everything straight away, you're kind of drip fed as we go through the book. Mm-hmm. But I didn't want her to be that traditional detective figure, because I think there is a lot particularly as a female detective. Again, I find when I read, they often take on kind of almost what would be seen as traditionally masculine kind of behaviours, and I just wanted her to be sort of very real and open. And I think lots of people who are in various roles, be it a detective or working in office environment, in whatever, how you're working, you perhaps would have those fears and anxieties. But I think when I'm reading books, sometimes it's not articulated in that way, and it's either kind of shown through a suppressed emotion, which I didn't want to do.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think it makes for a powerful read because, she's not, what I also loved about it is that she's both not your stereotypical cop protagonist. She's also not your stereotypical unreliable female narrator, which is something that we've seen so much, I think, in the last 10 years.
Yeah. Seriously appreciated that she's not, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
It's a great way into, and a setting that I think is familiar in the best of ways, especially from our perspective, because obviously, I think certainly anyone listening to this podcast who reads your book is going to, hear and feel the echoes of Christie, just to name a few. We got major shades of the Erymanthian boar when we were reading your book, which is, one of the Christie short stories in the Labors of Hercules, which actually does take place in an isolated hotel in the Swiss Alps. And it even involves going up in a funicular, which happens in your book in the beginning and is very sort of atmospheric. It's like, going past the point of no return, which I really love. And then, all of her closed circle mysteries, most famously, And Then There Were None. And I'm curious if it sounds like the kind of that elemental background, the idea of just, the ice and the snow overpowering, the humans, the very human drama, that is sort of centering in your story was important to you. Was it important to make the setting isolated in that classic mystery sort of a way? Was that a choice, or did it just kind of, happen?
Well, it was interesting. That's actually a really good question, because I think the setting itself, it very much was inspired by an article I'd read about Sanatorium, kind of the history in the Swiss Alps and in the town we visit in particular. But actually, the clinic that's kind of still going as a respiratory clinic in Crans-Montana isn't actually so isolated. But I very much kind of wanted to put it in that isolated location. I think as an author, and probably as a reader too, there's a real kind of sense of fun, I think, when you know that your characters have nowhere to go. You're putting them and kind of the reader under tension too. And I think as a reader, it's then really easy for you to put yourself in the character's shoes, because I think it's probably a fear of most people being in an isolated setting and there's no way out and there's a killer there, and what do you do? And I think, it really is, as a writer, you're sort of forced to kind of get quite creative with the motives. And that there is no Swiss police, there is no one who's going to kind of come in and save the day. And I think, in the best kind of Christies, like you mentioned, you really do have that sense of what is going to happen next and that fear, and you're sort of pulled along for the ride. So it was very intentional in that way. Yeah.
It's a crucible of a situation, right? I mean, the tension just sort of ramps up immediately when you know that you can't leave.
Exactly. It would be my fear.
It's really funny, Sarah. We had on... almost a year ago now, we had Ruth Ware on the podcast, and it was prior to One by One being published.
Yeah.
But, so we were talking to her not about that, but then when One by One came out in the autumn, I read that. And then when I was reading your book, I was like, oh my gosh, are these authors, somehow predictive? Because both of those books both your book and One by One are set in this isolation, and now we've all been in lockdown for so long. And I just was like, are they witches? I mean, how did they somehow know this sense? Because it's like somehow feels like there was a zeitgeist, because obviously you didn't write this during the pandemic.
No, absolutely. And I think there's actually a few more that have been set kind of in a similar setting, all at a similar time. So I don't know. I think we've tapped into some kind of collective.
Lucy Foley also.
Yep.
Right? Yes. So like I just don't know if there's like something in the water.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, interestingly, there's always lots of theories about that, isn't there? Of kind of is fiction predictive of things, and people kind of spotting a pattern and a trend in fiction in things that are happening. So yeah, maybe it's some kind of, we've tapped into a collective subconscious.
It's fascinating though, because it's just like obviously they weren't written while we were all in this situation. Now we've all been trapped for so long.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, it's interesting. It's kind of, I think, even pre-pandemic, I do think, I was chatting about it with, I think it was the Poison Pen bookstore. And yeah, I think there is that kind of sense now. I think the world has been quite unstable, hasn't it? So pre-pandemic, you had obviously, your political situation, our political situation with Brexit. And I think there was kind of this constant news kind of blasting all the time, which I think is also a product of sort of the digital age. And I think that kind of escape, I've discussed it with a few people. Are you kind of, in a way, going back to those locked room mysteries, that sense of escapism, that finality, that always having that answer at the end? It's quite a safe space, isn't it? So I don't know whether maybe it's more of a reflection of, the news prior to the pandemic. But yeah, it's a good point.
Well, there's a point that we always like to make. It's sort of the point of why did Golden Age mysteries become so massively popular? And part of the reason probably has to do a little bit with agency. Because in mystery novels, there is a solution at the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's really significant for a lot of people. It's significant. And people, when they talk about them as, comforting or whatnot, it's not obviously because of murder being comforting. It's that the world is made whole again at the end.
Yeah, and I think that's actually such a good point. My daughters now are Christie fans, not in terms of reading. They're obsessed with the TV adaptations, obsessed with the TV adaptations. And I think they very much, my elder daughter who's 10, and I think, it has been for her, the whole pandemic situation has been, hugely unsettling. They've not been able to go to school, all of those things. And she actually did sum it up. She said, I just like the endings. I like knowing what's happened. And I thought, yeah, that's absolutely it. In a world that's really unstable, having that, yep, we've got all the cast of characters together and Poirot's going to reveal the solution. It's comforting. It really is comforting.
We're all literally sitting, in our pajamas in front of our laptops, pulling our hair out, saying what's happening, like what is happening. Yes, that is, we are told we're not even told, as Catherine is saying, we figure out, right? Especially if we're active readers, we figure out exactly what's happening, and then we close the book, and that satisfaction, I think, can't be overstated in this time.
Yeah, which we can't have in real life.
No.
Right. I mean, there's an argument. It's always interesting. There's an argument about the gendering of mystery novels. It's really funny because so many mystery protagonists are actually male, but there's a huge argument to be made that the reason why the majority of mystery readers have historically been women goes back again to that agency thing, even in good times, because women generally, don't necessarily have that agency in the real world. But when you're reading a mystery, you can too be the detective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's flipping it on its head in perhaps a way that society, it wasn't traditionally had that way. I think that's a really good point.
This episode is brought to you by Best Fiends.
Even though things are beginning to look up, Catherine, I find myself awash with anxiety as much as ever these days, which is why I continue to be so grateful to have a fun, casual game to play like Best Fiends.
Oh, absolutely, Comfort. Best Fiends engages your brain without stressing you out, which is exactly what we all need right now.
And with thousands of levels to play, one of our listeners told us recently he shot past 1,000, in fact, the fun is practically unlimited.
And I hope you don't think that I'm going to do one of these conversations about best fiends without mentioning my beloved Howie the Lizard. I could never do Howie like that. That would be just terrible. So we're still plugging away, doing what we do best.
Killing slugs?
I was going to say being each other's soulmates, but sure, killing slugs too.
So engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must-play. Download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends.
I'm always curious, honestly, from a writerly perspective, as to choices involving POV, point of view. And given that so much of the book is from Ellen's point of view, you do break from it at key moments. And I was curious if when you were, in your planning and outlining stages, if you ever intended to do a first person point of view, or if just from the get-go you always knew that you wanted to do a close third-person POV with key breaks at key moments.
Yeah, no, that's another really good question, actually. I think really I did actually play around. It's a good point, because I did play around with the idea of first person, but I think Ellen is quite intense as a character as it is, and I think when you have that first person, you are really, really feeling things along with them, and I think it would be almost too intense as a reader. I think even now, when you said you kind of break away at key points, I did, because I think as a reader, you perhaps lose the impact as well. When you do have a character that's quite fragile in some ways, and you are sort of hearing and feeling those emotions alongside them. I think if I was to sort of go into first person and just stay with that, I think it could be perhaps overpowering. I think you might lose the kind of rise and fall of the sort of emotional arc of the character as well.
I love that. I suspected that your answer had to do with character and not with plotting, actually, because I was like, well, maybe, because it is difficult to pull off the first person POV in a mystery, just because sometimes it's difficult for that one character to have seen everything that needs to be seen. But I was like, I think if she had wanted to do that, she actually could have pulled that off, which is why I was very curious as to the thinking there. So that makes a lot of sense, actually. I think with a character like that, it can become almost oppressive, right? If because there's so much baggage, and you get to have your cake and eat it too with a close third person, because we really do get inside her experience, and yet we're not tethered to her for the entire story. That's really smart.
Absolutely. And I do think, just going back to the plotting bit, I just do think it's quite nice as a mystery writer. As you say, you could have made it work with just her, but I do think it is nice having key scenes where you are kind of going outside of that. You have moments, without giving too much away, where you have someone ski touring and that kind of thing, and other discoveries. And I think it sort of opens up the landscape outside of the hotel a little bit more, as well as obviously then I do similar in the prologue. But yeah, it's kind of a mixture of both. But I really do think that intensity of having her in first person, I think people have found her, interestingly, quite an intense and controversial character as she stands. So I think if it was first person, that might have been even more controversial.
Yeah. No, and we've talked about that with Christie, that, in the earlier books, a lot of them are from first person. She, very famously had a lot of the Poirot books narrated by Hastings, right, in first person. And there sometimes is some awkwardness to, plotting a mystery entirely from Hastings's perspective, or whatever he misses. And she definitely did move to doing a lot more third person in the middle and later stages of her career. And I think that it certainly, it smooths over the rough edges of some of those plotting concerns as well. But there is always a way around it. If you really want to do it, you can usually figure out a way, I think. So.
Yeah, I think it's just I was just to say, I think also it's kind of an interest thing. I think as a reader, I do like sometimes kind of switching up that point of view and just having a fresh story. So even if you're only with that character, for a few scenes, a few chapters, it's just that point of interest, I think, is nice, that break in a way.
Absolutely.
She, I don't think this is particularly a spoiler, but Ellen becomes increasingly reckless, really, as the book goes on. And I feel like if that had been the first person also, that would have been a lot to process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be a lot to process. And I think in a way you can kind of keep perhaps some of her motivations a little bit opaque, which I really like. But again, when I'm reading, I think, you can have some kind of tearing your hair out moments of why would you do that? But I think it kind of comes back to what I kind of want to achieve with her as a character in this book and in the next one. Of she's definitely not an unreliable narrator, but you do have that sense sometimes of not always knowing why she's doing things. And I think almost as a person, we don't always know ourselves. And I think she questions, again, without giving away too much, a lot of her sort of perceptions of her past and her memories. And I think in first person it's really hard to achieve that, because obviously you're in that person's head in a different way.
The only thing that I would say about it is that there is a moment in the sort of close to the denouement where she does one of those horror movie things where I was screaming at the book, do not do this. Do not do this.
I've had a few people saying at that point I was literally screaming. I'm not sure if it's the same point we're referring to, but
yeah, we don't want to spoil anything, but I was like, oh no. Just no.
just don't. But yeah, I think that kind of sense of unraveling a little bit, I think it's just fun as well as an author. I'll be brutally honest. I think there is a sense of fun of plunging a character into something and having them sort of, they're unraveling in that situation. She is increasingly kind of not knowing who to trust, what's going on. And I think that's really fun to have, will she pull back from that situation or not? But I won't give away any spoilers as to whether she does or not.
No, that's one of my favorite things too. And I think, beyond just the basic isolated setting, that was another connection that I found to And Then There Were None, because it's one of my favorite aspects of And Then There Were None, how you start off with, this house and it's modern and sparkly and you're on this island and all of these people are kind of posturing to each other. And then it just slowly, bit by bit, breaks down and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And it's just, until you essentially have, the nihilism of the end. And I wouldn't say that it gets quite to that point in your book, but there's a similar kind of breakdown of, the miniature society that you're creating here in this very posh sort of environment. And I love seeing that just go to tatters.
I do too. It was hugely fun.
Well, but for both of you, do we think that the modernism is also somehow responsible for this? Because in both of them, There Were None and Sarah, in your book, it is stark modernism that is at the center of the architectural drama.
Well, it's a really fascinating thing. And linking back to the pandemic, when I was researching and just after, I read a really interesting article about, how does architecture respond to things that were going on. So obviously modernism directly influenced by the kind of sanatoriums throughout Europe and elsewhere, and that kind of idea that we want everything clean and kind of lots of clean lines and big windows, etc. And they were saying kind of, has the pandemic, will that change architecture? And kind of now going forward, you had the self-cleaning doorknobs we're hearing about and all these kind of things. And I do think there's a kind of, in a way, I find somehow sort of clinical things quite horrifying. And I think it probably taps into my dark fears of hospitals for various reasons. And I think that sort of clean lines and the modernism, I think it can be aesthetically very appealing, but I think, there is something quite cold about it. And I think the idea of, as Kevin mentioned, kind of bringing that back to, putting that to tatters is quite satisfying. So there might well be a link.
Yeah. And it's almost what I also love that you did in your book, which, for me reminded me of some horror tropes, actually some horror movie tropes, is that it's not only that it's, this hotel has this modernist look of, the clean lines and the open spaces, which, can just very quickly turn into a nightmare as it does. But there's also this sense that, when the hotel was being designed, that the architects incorporated its past into the design very specifically, whereby they're actually displaying pieces from the sanatorium that used to be. And there's something about the arrogance of that and sort of the hubris of, hey, take a look at this weird instrument of, that was used to potentially,
yeah.
cure, maybe torture an ill person 100 years ago. Isn't this curious?
They never actually put them on display though, right?
Yeah, no, there are elements throughout the hotel actually where, I'm sorry, you do have them kind of in a glass box. And I think now it's quite interesting when you have kind of a distance from a certain time period. I do think the idea, I'd actually was, again, it's research for the book. I mentioned in the book about a kind of couple that were found on a glacier years after they went missing. The glacier retreat, and they were found. And there was some really quite intrusive photographs that was put online about that. And I think it's interesting now, and there have recently been some in Pompeii as well, showing kind of human remains. And I think when you have almost like a certain distance from time, people kind of feel it's up for grabs to kind of display things and talk about it in a way you wouldn't do with a kind of contemporary tragedy. And I think there's almost a human appetite in a way for something that you kind of can look at because, it's so far away that it doesn't matter. And I think that's the point one of the characters sort of makes later in the book. It's kind of sort of looking the other way and using it for your own ends, which it's interesting.
Well, it's that idea that in a horror movie, and for some reason the one I'm thinking of is the original Poltergeist, right? Which is this idea that you're building over something that you should not be desecrating, and as an audience member in that movie that the characters are going to have to pay for what they did somehow, because that's just not going to fly in a horror story. And I think you get that creeping sense in your book too, that the arrogance of this design and, putting those things on display in those little glass cases, very quickly we realize that someone's very angry about that and they're going to have to pay for that. So it's just this added little kind of, it's like a horror frisson that kind of just reverberates throughout the story that I really, really loved.
Thank you.
It really added to the atmosphere, I think, that you were creating.
Yeah, I think that, sorry, Kathy, I was going to say that I think that suppression of the past, I wanted it to very much to link in with sort of Ellen's internal landscape as well and how she is feeling, and that's constant suppression of the past. But I agree. I think that kind of sense that you're, trying to build over or sort of push something away. But I just love the idea, like you say, it is a kind of classic horror thing that no matter what you do, it's always there bubbling away.
Yeah, it's not gonna go away, and it's part of the mystery though, because it is a long time ago. I mean, the past, the whole history of the sanatorium is basically 100 years ago, and the characters even say that. They're like, but that was so long ago. Who would still be angry about that? It's not like this just happened 20 years ago, so it happened to some person who's now running around killing people. Like, how does this? And it's true. It truly is a mystery, and you solve that mystery in I thought a very satisfying way. So.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, Catherine. I realised that.
No, I was going to say that. I mean, there's like an interesting point that it's not so much explicitly made in it, but they're burying the archive of it. The archive is locked in a room, and I mean, I do wonder about that just in general, like in society. And I think it was an interesting concept that the majority of the archive, and that's sort of one of the arguments against one of the characters, that he never intended to make it available.
Yeah. No, I think that sense. I think that the idea that you can kind of not forget something, but kind of, it's the burying of it. I think of kind of contemporary parallels with regards to the Holocaust and various things. And I think that sense of needing to keep history alive, it was interesting where you mentioned we have the characters kind of saying, but it was so long ago. I do think we're in a society where everything's changing so quickly. I don't think I can even keep pace of, technology and how things have changed. And I do really worry about kind of past events for my children. Will things get forgotten in that way? And I think, that kind of archive, I'm someone who likes kind of storing things and having things set. And it was quite important for me to kind of pull out, was that archive ever going to be made available, or was that kind of just lip service?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I've been reading, for whatever reason, probably because I've been locked inside for so long, I've been reading a bunch of new Holocaust nonfiction books, mostly about women. And there's one, it's coming out soon. It's called The Light of Days. But it's about the Polish courier girls.
Oh, wow.
And it was just buried in some. I think the author just found it. I don't know if it was in the British Library, but in England, she just found these accounts in Yiddish that and they had been translated and they'd been widely published in like the UK after the war, and then they had just fallen out of print forever and forgotten.
Oh, that makes me go a little bit shivery in a way. The idea that, something so, oh.
And so, I mean, and they played like a massive role in like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and other things. And they're just disappeared to history because they were just buried in an archive. And I actually found that oddly haunting. Not just, we'll just say that the room that the archive is buried in your book has another secret in it.
Yeah.
Not going to spoil it. It has another
big secret. Yeah.
But I, for some reason, I found the burying of the history in it haunting as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that idea that things people I think over time memories do change, and I think people's responses, and just hearing my own daughter's experience of how things are taught in schools are different, because that generational connection, when I talked about the war, I could directly reference my grandfather and his experiences, and our children can't do that. And I think the idea that that might potentially be suppressed or not be remembered is kind of terrifying for me. I think it's probably a really personal thing. I'm very obsessed with kind of printing off photographs and having that material. Yeah. And I think not having that one day is hugely terrifying. I was also, my own research, without giving away too many spoilers about kind of the plot at all, but I found some awful articles, amazing in one way, around kind of the treatment of women in these weren't tuberculosis sanatoria, they were different ones, but there were amazing archive material that again has been found about how women were sent off to these institutions often and kind of only on the whim of their kind of doctor or male guardian. And again, I was horrified, the stories of all of these women who were, perhaps locked up for 30 or 40 years. And you didn't really hear from them again. And I found that horrifying. Just the ideas that these lives were almost wiped out in a way. Scary. I
mean, I think that there's a real sense, I'm trying to do this without spoiling anything. There's...
I'm sure you can do a few spoilers.
There's a real sense that women's histories are erased, even with contemporary women in your book.
Yeah.
And I think that's the unsettling thing about this, like, secret archive room, is that that is what a lot of the trauma in the book is about. It is about women's narratives being erased.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the history element I mentioned I just found really, really powerful. But I think there are sort of still some parallels. I think women are often, and it's not always women, I think it can be men too, but I think women can be kind of held up and judged to a sort of standard by, not just by men, but by other women too. And I think it's kind of, I think we're categorized in some ways. And I think when women perhaps become mothers or you evolve in life, often your sort of very interior life can be forgotten. And I think, women's stories in general, I don't think women are sometimes heard. And I think one of the things I wanted to get through with Ellen is because women perhaps communicate in a different way, and it's experiences I've had in the work life and in personal life, I think women's stories and just women's voices can be dismissed. We're seen as perhaps too emotional, or you're saying something in an emotional way. And I don't think we're always heard because of that, because it isn't a traditionally sort of male way of communicating, which perhaps is more factual. And I think you've got the characters around Ellen actually responding to that. And it's interesting, even her own sort of partner has sort of struggles with when she speaks quite openly emotionally. And that was something I wanted to explore as well.
Well, I mean, he is an architect, and like I have spent some time around architects, like a significant amount of time around architects.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of a thing. So,
intriguing.
No, I'm not. I like the fact that he doesn't pick up on some of her emotional cues is perhaps not surprising.
I like that. That's very good.
Now, I think that even in a more general sense, like so many stories, I think that your story is, on a deeper level underneath the mystery, preoccupied with storytelling, right? I mean, I think so many stories are just about how we tell stories. And, there's that notion that who controls the story, who gets to tell the story, how much of the story gets told, how much do we pick and choose? There's obviously, some retelling or even warped storytelling that's going on vis-a-vis the sanatorium and what happened in the past. As that story is being told by the designers of the hotel and the proprietors of the hotel. But then, there's Ellen herself who's grappling with her own story and, recent events in the past that happened to her. Won't get more into that because I don't want to spoil, but, she really needs to figure out what actually happened to her and what that means and how she's going to move forward given what's happening in this very story. So it's just, I think like the best of stories, there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
Once you start thinking about it. So I thank you for providing a story that has so much to chew on as a reader.
Thank you.
And can we safely say that there's going to be a sequel?
Yeah, no, most definitely. It's actually first draft is already written, so I'll be working on that one. But we kind of leave on a bit of a cliffhanger.
I was going to say, otherwise the book kind of ends on a note where I was upset if there was not going to be another one.
Yeah, no, I think Ellen and kind of that what Kemp was saying then actually about the story. I think she has more to say really. I think that idea of sort of her, does she trust herself and her memory really sort of comes to the play in the next book. So it will be a continuation.
That's fantastic. Well, we can't let you go without asking you just at least two Christie focused questions. I'm just curious if you have a favorite Christie. We just have to ask everyone.
Oh, it's actually so hard because I think it also depends if my kind of Christies are really woven into the TV adaptations as well, and
That's
kind of
fun.
what my favourites are. But I absolutely love, I think probably one of my favourites is Death in the Clouds. And when we were talking before about kind of isolated settings, I don't think you could have anything more isolated than that. I really love the kind of idea that there isn't, even in my book, I think, you're isolated, you have the avalanche, but you're not always quite sure who was there and when. And I think in that one, you have something that's so closed off. And I have to say, a few of them I've had ideas. That one confounded me and absolutely did. And I think there's so many kind of nice moments just from the TV adaptation. I loved just Poirot's facial expressions, but I think his kind of indignancy comes across in the book as well, that sort of being a suspect. Just loads of key moments I really didn't guess. And I think, the ending, I presume I can give away spoilers here because everyone's well read. I love the idea of the dentist coat and the steward. Everything was just perfect. And I had no idea. And a few I have.
It's really funny, Sarah, but I was in preparing to talk to you, I was trying to think of the other Christies that have extremely isolated settings because, we talk about this. Sometimes people confuse locked room mysteries with closed circle mysteries, and locked room is a very specific thing. And Christie does do that occasionally, but closed circle doesn't necessarily require absolute isolation. Often it can just be, you're in a country house and probably no one drove up in the middle of the night and scaled a wall, and we don't have to. They could have, and maybe occasionally that actually is a solution, but we usually don't have to worry about that. But I was kind of
I can think of one particular case.
Listing her best, pure isolation books, and a lot of the obvious ones are, and then there were none. I think Cards on the Table, Evil Under the Sun, Toward Zero, but Death in the Clouds was another one. And it's funny, we haven't ranked it that high. It's not one of our highest ranked, but it is actually, in terms of an isolated setting, definitely one of the best that she created, and quite early too, when air travel was still, a little bit of a novelty. So I do commend her for for the setting.
Yeah, I think for me that the idea of being, it's probably again taps into a few of my own fears of being on a plane, and there is nowhere to go, is there? I think in any other setting there's always perhaps room for escape. You could run around, in my book perhaps you could run off towards the woods, something could happen, but I think being on a plane, I think it's a really kind of clever idea. Yeah,
it also has one of the best of the Tom Adams Fontana covers. I don't know, Sarah, if you've ever seen it, but it is a real delight.
Oh, no, I haven't. How would you describe?
I would describe it as a giant wasp attacking.
Oh, I love the wasp.
I'll take a photograph of my cover. So.
Oh yeah, I'd like to see that. I have to say I do love book covers. It's a big fascination for me, and how they change with the Harry Potter ones as well. I love the new illustrated editions. I was showing my daughter some of the older ones. I love it.
And that cover very famously inspired a Doctor Who episode that features Agatha Christie as a character.
I didn't know that. Oh, that's an interesting fact. I like that.
Yeah. And then I'm just curious, do you have a preference between Poirot and Marple?
It's a bit of an easy one, actually. I do like Marple, but I have to say Poirot. And again, it's probably influenced by the David Suchet adaptations. It's the shame because I can't really read without seeing him as a character. But yeah, I love, there is definitely humour in Marple, but I think in Poirot, I just love everything about him as a character. I love the fastidious, the kind of, all of his traits, it's really evocative. And again, seeing my children's responses to him as a character, tells me just how great a character he is, and I think he will go down in history.
I'm just delighted by the fact I came across Christie originally like sitting on my mother's lap, watching the Suchet adaptations. And then I read Nancy. I was like an early reader, so I read Nancy Drew, as you did also. Yeah. And then the first things I pulled off the shelves were all my mother's like paperbacks from like the 70s of Christie. And but it was totally because of the Suchet series.
Yeah, I said when you watch them now, and even some of the earlier ones, because I think when you have Jap in them as well, you really, and Hastings going back to, and Jap as well, and Miss Lemon, there's a real humour there. Obviously, as the books progress, it gets darker as well. And seeing my children's faces respond to, I'd say it's just very theatre acting in a way. I mean, just a movement of the eyebrow, a twitch of the mouth, that actually properly laughing. And this was my kind of daughter, age 6, my youngest, she's 8 now. So watching the first one, seeing her reaction, I said that it's just amazing acting. And Miss Lemon, just her expressions and even the hair, just perfect.
So delightful. We did our last episode that we just put out was the Clapham Cook, which is the first episode of the series. And Kemper and I just went on and on about because I hadn't watched the episode in years.
Yeah.
And it's so well set up, and they're so particular. And the idea that children right now could be watching that and still be delighted by it, just it warms my heart so much. Sarah, you have no idea.
But there is so much humour, isn't it, in those early ones? It's just, beautiful. I just think the magical interactions between them, and when they go on to meet Jap, it's just amazing. And she kind of has even dressed up as Poirot. That's the sort of mild obsession they work through. But unfortunately, we only get a few episodes kind of dropped onto our streaming thing at a time. So they go jump from series to series, but they love it.
I think if your entry point to Christie is the David Suchet series, it makes a lot of sense that, Poirot is always going to be beloved. And I feel like you were slightly apologetic when you said, my entry point or a lot of the way I've consumed Christie has been through the series. But I think that's such a common thing. And it's especially I think, and this is really coming off of our adulation of the Suchet series from the Adventure of the Clapham Cook episode. But he was so anchored to the text, and he took such care with what he was doing in that series that I think it provided this, this kind of robust alternate path to Christie that so many people have taken up. I think especially in the UK and the US as well. I'm sure around the world. I know it's distributed everywhere around the world, but That's such a common, story, I think, for people, and it's fantastic because it truly is, part of the quote unquote Christie verse that we talk about.
Well, also, by the way, can we ask you? You can say nothing, but do you have fantasy casting for Ellen?
Ooh, I don't. People have asked me this quite a few times. Actually, I have to say I don't. The creation of Ellen in my head. I'm a real kind of scrapbooker. So when I'm writing, I kind of pull out lots of things from magazines, and it kind of she's a little bit ever evolving. So no, I don't have a fixed person. She's sort of very much probably in a similar way to when you read, you have an idea, don't you, of how someone looks in your head. So there's probably not someone I would say now that's absolutely an Ellen. No, so.
Is there a film in the works, or is it still early days?
I think probably still early days, actually.
Well, I have no doubt that there will be something.
Oh, thank you.
Something there, or at least I hope so. I can't wait to watch that story.
Yeah, it would be amazing. I think one of the interesting things to me would be the hotel, because it has been interpreted differently on the UK and US book covers. And it's interesting. A few readers have kind of said, "Oh, neither were quite how I imagine." And obviously we're showing the old building on the covers as opposed to the new hotel. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it would be interesting to see how that would play out.
Absolutely. Extremely cinematic.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, this was such a delight, Sarah, being able. I almost called you Ellen, by the way. I almost just like Ellen.
Interchangeable, yeah. It's good.
It really was delightful sitting down with you. I mean, and the fact that you were able to identify, another writer that Catherine and I are both passionate about that we haven't even discussed. I'm floored by that. We're going to have to go gush over Tessa Hadley now. I think.
I know that was amazing for me because genuinely I don't meet loads of fans of Tessa Hadley, so it's a really lovely surprise. Both of you as well.
Thank you so much for sitting down with us. And we obviously, we can't wait for the sequel. Very happy to hear that there's already a draft.
Very excited, Sarah.
Eagerly awaiting
it.
We hope to talk again.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, Catherine, that conversation with Sarah was truly, truly lovely.
Oh, she could not have been more of a delight. And, we're looking really forward to her sequel. She mentions it in the podcast, but, we got official notification afterwards, and we're very excited for that.
We have every hope of it being as much of a bestseller and a nail biter as the first one was. And it's really exciting when I think a new author enters the scene, and it makes me feel really good about the years to come, during which we can enjoy Sarah Pearse novels along with all of the many other contemporary authors who we rely on, year after year.
Absolutely.
I think for new content. It's hugely important now more than ever.
And we are going to look forward to talking to her in the future as well.
Yes, big friend of the podcast from this point forward. So that was our special interview episode. And in our next episode, we will be covering a Poirot short story. We do still have a few of those left. I love being able to revisit our dear Belgian detective in short story form. We'll be covering an early Poirot too. It is The King of Clubs. So very much looking forward to that. And then our next novel is also a Poirot novel, just in case you want to do some reading ahead of time. That would be The Clocks. Much more to come. And in the meantime, you can always reach out to us via email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can also find bonus content on our Patreon site. That's www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. We are on Twitter at allaboutthedame. Catherine is on Twitter at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha. Our Instagram handle is at All About Agatha. And we would love it if you would give us a rating and or a review if you have not yet done so. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.